Mr. Speaker, I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish a review of the case for a levy on the gross revenues of gambling firms and to require that review to make recommendations on the possible uses of revenue from such a levy in connection with research on gambling addiction, protections for children and other vulnerable people at risk of being harmed by gambling, and gambling addiction clinics and for connected purposes. Mr. Speaker, there is very little, if anything, more important for MPs to do than supporting and protecting the most vulnerable in our nation. Typically, that is reflected in the huge amount of our public spending rightly spent on welfare and pensions, in using science and technology for remarkable solutions to health, including mental health issues, and in much greater awareness of and legislation against hatred and prejudices of all kinds. But this bill aims to help a different sort of vulnerability, that of the increasing amount of addiction to gambling, which, in extreme circumstances, has led and does lead to suicide. There is nothing more sad than meeting a constituent or non-constituent who has lost a child to suicide from the pressures of gambling debts. Even one life destroyed by gambling is too many. And the depressing thing, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that we simply do not know how many people have committed suicide from gambling. The only statistics available suggest that last year, between 250 and 650 gamblers committed suicide. I know of at least one case where the family ensured that gambling was not the reason given at the inquest. For how many more is this true? What is the real figure of suicide gamblers? And whether it's 250 or 650, this surely tells us forcefully that the assumptions in the 2005 Gambling Act about gambling being harmless for the vast majority of people need to be challenged, that existing protections are not working as they should, and that we, government, parliament, regulator, the gambling sector, charities, us as a society, need to do a lot more to protect those vulnerable to gambling addiction. And this is now urgent, Madam Deputy Speaker, because the problem is getting worse. There are now over 55,000 young people under the age of 14 already addicted, a figure up sharply on even 2 years ago, and rising fast. That's alongside 430,000 adults with a serious gambling issue, what we would in normal English call addicts, and 2 million described as at risk. And that is, above all, why I seek leave today to bring in a bill to ask the government to review the case for a levy. I cannot, in a 10-minute rule bill, ask directly for a specific levy, although, as Simon and Garfunkel once put it, if I could, I surely would. The main aim of such a levy would be to research what causes gambling addiction. How does it start? Who is it most likely to impact? Who is most vulnerable? How can we spot the signs? And what can we do to prevent it? And although prevention is always better than cure, what more can we do through gambling clinics and other means to help those already addicted? What can we learn from those who've almost become addicted and pull back successfully on their own or with help? And this needs an immediate and deep investment of research to analyse the extent of gambling addiction, including looking at all aspects of marketing and advertising by gambling companies. The chair of the regulator, the Gambling Commission, said that problem gambling has a real cost to the economy and to the individuals and families affected by it, although the scale of the adverse impact is currently poorly understood. And that, Madam Deputy Speaker, is a huge understatement. The damage done to not just individual lives, but families and friends with strains on relationships, marriage, jobs and mental health is already considerable and getting worse. Let me say something about a potential levy on gambling company gross profits. The industry's gross profits of 14 billion and tax receipts of 3 billion, 100,000 employees and £200 million of advertising revenues give us an idea of the volume of gambling. And although the regulator currently requires a voluntary contribution, the current amount raised, 9 million a year, is tiny compared to the size of the industry. A reasonable levy could therefore generate significant revenue both to fund new independent research, recommend much greater protection for children and other vulnerable people at risk, including university students, often lonely and mentally unconfident in new surroundings. Such a levy could also fund jointly commissioned gambling clinics, like the new one in London and a new one coming soon in Leeds. At the moment, just 2% of those who need help get it, and that cannot be right. The Gordon Moody Association rehabilitation centres have long waiting lists, and a levy could bring those down and provide help as early as possible. In short, Madam Deputy Speaker, addiction is a public health issue, but gambling addiction involves every aspect of the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport, and a levy on the gambling sector to fund the help needed would surely make a difference. Madam Deputy Speaker, I also think that research could inform my belief that more action is needed to protect the young from gambling advertising. That means eliminating gambling advertising on live sports programmes. More than 90 minutes of betting adverts were shown during the Football World Cup, and no live sport now on non-BBC channels is free of gambling advertising. 3 big companies have already agreed to do this in principle, and I believe this should be implemented as soon as possible. But we should go further, and the Gambling Commission should consider banning gambling advertising during live sport altogether. The levy could also be used to build on much stronger self-exclusion with real commitments from banks. How can gamblers access credit they clearly cannot afford, racking up massive debts without gambling companies, banks or regulator being able to prevent it? Why can't banks identify the issue earlier? And how easy is it for gamblers to completely self-exclude, to stop getting emails or text highlighting the latest improbable deal? There is currently no easy way for gamblers to put effective blocks on debit card transactions, and that's why I fully endorse the Gambling Commission's discussions with banks about how to improve protection for problem gamblers, and I urge both to move fast on real attention, and I hope that research would echo that. Madam Deputy Speaker, there has been progress in the software used by some gambling companies to allow for effective self-exclusion. But I've also been shown how easy it is to get around this, and some gamblers will go to great lengths to get around self-exclusion blockages. I've seen evidence of how difficult it can be to contact a human in the gambling companies, and I've seen how once a company has an individual's contact details, they will pump out attractive, if sometimes misleading, special offers day and night. The review could look at how self-exclusion can become an absolute guaranteed 100% opt-out, no ifs and no buts. And such a levy, which would presumably go to the Gambling Commission, could also recommend how we can best use technology to protect more people, not just to expand the amount of gambling. Using software like Gamban for blocking gambling sites can help the self-exclusion issue, and it should surely be mandatory for all the gambling companies to have such systems. There are other tools which could be developed to help protect the young, like facial recognition to block underage gambling more effectively. Madam Deputy Speaker, this 10-minute rule bill cannot solve all the problems thrown up by the opening up of the gambling sector through the 2005 Act, nor is it remotely an attempt to try and ban all gambling. But ultimately, it was Parliament that opened the door to online gambling, and with it has come a growing number of citizens vulnerable to gambling addiction. It is no good imagining that the regulator can manage all of the problems alone. We here have a special responsibility, and I believe that a review of a mandatory levy to fund vital research, protection strategies, changes of policy on credit and access to the money that has led, in some cases, to tragic deaths, as well as new policies and clinics and rehabilitation centres to help cure those addicted, all of these things would make a real difference. As I said at the beginning, we, society, need to consider our approach to gambling. Will it be the tobacco of this generation, something once widely advertised, then restricted, and now banned from advertising altogether? Will those damaged or even killed by gambling be our legacy, or is this our chance to get the balance between funding sport, using technology, and having the right protections to prevent tragedy? I believe this bill, requiring such a review of a mandatory levy, were the government to go ahead with it, would make recommendations across different aspects of gambling and protection and would be a major step forward, for we need action now.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith, Sir Peter Bottomley, Simon Hart, Andrew Selous, Alex Burkhart, Tom Watson, Carolyn Harris, Graham Jones, Christine Jardine, Ronnie Cowan, Jim Shannon and myself. Yeah.
Richard Graham.
Gambling, Industry Levy Review and Protections for Vulnerable People Bill.
Second reading what day?
With good fortune and the support of the Leader of the House, Madam Deputy Speaker, Friday the 10th of May.
Friday the 10th of May. We now come to the Opposition Day motion in the name of the Leader of the Opposition on local government and social care funding. I must inform the House that the Speaker has not selected the amendment. Shadow Secretary of State Andrew Gwynn to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I beg to move the motion.